Of Steve Bantu Biko. He was restricted to the King Williamstown area during his banning orders back in 1973, and as a result, the Steve Biko Centre was then established in Ginsberg in King Williamstown. This morning, we cross live to our reporter who is in King Williamstown, Busi Jemsana. Molo Sisi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Palisa.
But a little
Hear
bit
you,
about...
Palisa?
Yes, loud and clear. Tell us about the importance of the centre where you are this morning.
Indeed, Palisa, we are at the Steve Biko Centre, where the life and times of the Black consciousness movement leader, Steve Biko, is documented. At a very early age, when he went to varsity, he joined politics and became very active. That gave a rise to the South African Student Organization, in which only black students would join the organization. An indication that at a very young age, at a very tender age, Steve Biko strongly believed that black people needed to have self-love, needed to love their identity, needed to have self-reliance on their blackness, and not feel any inferiority during those times. A leader indeed, and that proved to be a stepping ladder to the Black consciousness movement, in which he co-founded in those days. He became the voice of ordinary black people when the PAC and the ANC were banned. He became the voice, and that led to him being restricted and detained in King Williamstown, his home. But Palisa, no one knows the story of Steve Biko more than his son, Nkosinathi BIko. He joins us now to tell us about his father. The country lost a leader. You lost your father. You were at 6 at that time. Do you remember anything about your father during that time?
Well, certainly, but let me start elsewhere. I want to thank you as the SABC team for doing a wonderful job of capturing the attention of the public around the 40th anniversary. Great job this morning. Of course, I remember. I am a father of 3, and my daughter, the second one, is now 6, around about the age I was when my father died. And the conversations we are having with her tell me that she is an informed little being. I have my own memories, albeit that they are memories, of course, that lasted only till I was about 6.5, because after that he was no more. One of my favorite ones is attending at a local school, St. Patrick's, and we were asked by our teacher to draw something that was on the board and replicate it on paper. And I was the only one who couldn't do this assignment. It seemed to me impossible. And so I go home and I'm upset because everybody else has done this, and I'm being laughed at. And my father was the only one who understood that the term exact also means dimension, size, which was impossible to replicate on paper. There are many, of course, father and son and stories like that we can tell.
And speaking of the life and times of Steve Biko, his legacy, do you think in this day and age that his legacy continues to find space in the country?
His legacy continues to be relevant. There is no doubt about that. And young people are telling us so. When they are on campus protesting about fees that must fall and roads that must fall, it is to Steve Biko that they resort and find the vocabulary that goes with that. And I think that the 110,000 beneficiaries of the center here that come through every day, the young people, continue to remind us of the relevance of Steve Biko. I do think that the country is at a point where it is also trying to find itself. And I think we've come to a point where, whereas in the past there may have been political differences between parties, there is a common understanding that Steve Biko offered something that this country needs, even 23 years into democracy.
Interesting that you should make an example of the protests that are happening in varsities, because in 1976, history tells tells us that Steve Biko, when learners at Forbes Grant banned the school, he called them to say, we do not ban schools, we do not ban infrastructure. We want them to respect us. We want to find comfort in our skins. And now, students are on the streets. They are banning structures. They are banning universities. What would he say? What would you say to them?
Well, in 1976, it was unacceptable. And I think the thinking was that those institutions represented, if in the case of Forbes, Bantu education, and therefore an extension of the system. But nevertheless, it was unacceptable. It is certainly unacceptable in 2017 that we would resort to the destruction of community assets that are of value. We know that the country is stretched for resources, but I think that the real question is the underlying reasons why people still do that. And I think these are the things we need to attend to. The statistician general reminded us not so long ago that in excess of 50% of our South Africans live under the breadline, live in poverty. And if our constitution promises life and dignity, then it would mean, if that is indeed the case, that we are in violation of our constitution. We are visiting atrocities on our people that defy the promise of our constitution, dignified living.
And would you say we need leaders like Steve Biko to lead, to make sure that we do not violate that same constitution that they died for?
I think that there are many leaders in South Africa that have contributed immensely to our political principles. And I think that we can harvest from Steve Biko. We certainly can harvest from Robert Sobukwe and many, many of our leaders useful lessons that could give further traction to our democracy.
And lastly, I can't say goodbye to you without going back to black consciousness, what he stood for. Do you think black people, years down the line, 40 years after his death, are proud of being black and do not feel the inferiority that he fought for?
Well, what he ultimately stood for was creating a link between a very strong consciousness of self and, in his case, the emancipatory program, right? And although he was the father of black consciousness and is referred to as such, he actually challenged even white South Africa to revisit its own consciousness and this culture of superiority. So is there relevance for that now? I think so. I think that we do, we ought to have been past the stage as a country of having the debates that we are having between ourselves as South Africans, black and white, and within our communities as black people.
Nkosinathi, thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. That was the son of the late Steve Biko, Nkosinathi BIko, saying we ought to harvest from the legacy of Steve Biko. And indeed, his legacy continues to live on in Ginsberg, where he grew up, in King Williamstown, in the Eastern Cape, in the country at large. And we know that the world has joined South Africa in commemorating and celebrating a life well lived. And Palisa, in Steve Biko's words, indeed, black is beautiful. Back to you.
Oh, Biko, Biko, Bikos, Biko. This song was written for a very brave man.
We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people.
A man who preached non-violence in a state which has racism enshrined in its constitution. A man who was imprisoned, tortured and killed in a jail in South Africa. This is for Stephen Biko.